Hey everybody, Chuck Marone. I'm at the World War II Memorial, and it has inspired me to talk a little bit about the end of World War II and the beginning of the Suburban experiment. I feel like it's one of these things that when we talk about it, it becomes self-evident, but when we don't, we can get trapped kind of in recency bias, I guess is what I would say. At the end of World War II, there was deep concern amongst economists that once we ended the war, once the war was over, we were just going to slide right back into the Great Depression. The Great Depression was one of these very disorienting periods of time. What caused the Great Depression? We still debate that today. What got us out of the Great Depression? When we think about that, we are told that the thing that got us out of the Great Depression is World War II, to which I say, you're living in a country dominated by economists and kind of the warped economic thinking when, the gravy train has arrived when we have global war, right? Yay, tens of millions dead, rationing gasoline and butter and meat. But hey, GDP went up, so great. I think it's sick, but nonetheless, World War II got a whole lot of people who hadn't been working. It got a whole bunch of industries that hadn't been running, shifted over to wartime production. We shipped a whole bunch of people overseas to kill and to die. We took a whole bunch of people and put them to work building ships and planes and munitions and all the stuff of war. Unlike World War I, where it wasn't really clear who would win until the very end, right? It was like back and forth until like the last 6 months. It was pretty clear on like December 8th, 1941, who was going to win World War II. The Western powers had much greater capacity in the European theater, US and England, along with, the Soviet Union, had much greater capacity than Germany. It was just a matter of time and resources. How much would it take? How many people were going to die? How much would we have to expend to make sure that we won? And so there was a lot of planning for what would happen after World War II that happened during the war. The whole Bretton Woods conference was done to establish the global economic system. That was done 2.5, 3 years before the end of the war. But the economists around FDR were worried because they said, hey, when this war is over, guess what's going to happen? We're going to go right back into the Great Depression. When we demobilize all these troops, when we shut down all these industries of war, there's nothing really different about our economy today than there was, back in the 1930s. We're going to go right back to where we were. Of course, that's not what happened, right? We have the gift of hindsight. We can sit back and recognize that we had decades of the most aggressive expansion ever. I mean, we built a middle class. We nostalgized this generation as the greatest generation, came back for more, built the suburbs, built the interstates, built the American dream, created kind of the prosperity that we're all floating off today. At least that's the narrative that we're given, right? This was done as an antidote to depression. And the idea was we were, the only industrial economy not decimated by war. We were we had all this land. We had more oil coming in the ground than Saudi Arabia. We were ridiculously successful in many ways. And when we demobilized all these troops, we just took all of that excess capacity that we had and we put it into building a new version of America. We did build the interstates. We did create a massive housing market. We did create all kinds of subsidies to get people into single-family homes. We created all kinds of programs to help build sewer and water systems and all the kind of infrastructure that would be needed for this expansion. We did all these things to create, essentially to turn our cities into machines of growth. And it is in being a machine of growth that our cities were able to kind of lift us out of the Great Depression. Of course, if you're a strong townsperson, you understand the trade-off in this. When we get a first generation of growth, it's all financed by the private sector. right? It's rolled over into people's mortgages. People are paying for that at the same time they're paying taxes. When that first life cycle is up and all the maintenance comes due, then what do? And in our case, what we did is we had a period of high inflation and we had a modest recession. And we got out of that by bailing out banks and going back to inflation. And it's been a steady up, down, up, down, up, down, higher ups and less aggressive downs ever since. We've been kind of coasting off those fumes from this great kinetic explosion of building and energy that came after World War II. All of it was done with the mindset of keeping us out of the next Great Depression. I think, you know, in my darkest days, I look at it and say, we did keep us out of the Great Depression, right? We did keep us out of it. We just postponed it, right? We postponed that reckoning. We built stuff that wasn't financially viable, wasn't financially productive, created a lot of transactions, took on a lot of debt, made a lot of promises to ourselves in the future, and we'll see what happens. I'm pessimistic about that side of it. But I think it's important to recognize, you know, as I'm standing back and looking at the World War II memorial, I try to be generous to people of the past. I've said this many times, you know, I think it's important to be generous to them. I hope someday that our descendants will be generous to us, because I think we're good people trying to do the right thing. We don't always do the right thing. We struggle, right? We make compromises, you know, but we try to do the right thing many times. I hope people are generous to us. I try to be generous to them. And I recognize that they had gone through a decade of economic turmoil and dislocation. Some of the most difficult periods of time. I read stuff about what people went through back then and I'm just astounded. I talked to my grandpa and he describes what he went through and he describes himself as being lucky. And I think, oh my gosh, if you were lucky, what does it mean to be unlucky? Then they went through war, like the most grotesque, horrible war that the world has ever been through. They went through it. And then they came back and they were optimistic about the future. And they did this thing that was crazily optimistic. I understand why they did it. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it work, but I understand why they did it. If we can understand why they did it, we can see a little bit into our own nature and understand why we have fought so hard to maintain it, despite how obviously destructive it is.